We know that compound lifts will generally lay the foundations of a solid hypertrophy training program. However, should we be putting more emphasis on training some of the smaller accessory muscles using isolation lifts? Or will the compound lifts train those muscles enough to achieve adequate muscle growth over time? In this video, we will explore these questions and provide some practical advice to implement into your own training routine. To answer this question, we first need to take a look at the primary compound lifts to understand what muscles they train. At the most basic level, there are 4 primary movements which will essentially train all muscles of the body to some extent. First is an upper body push. This refers to any pressing movements from overhead to horizontal or even decline. Some examples of upper body pushing exercises include the bench press, military press, and incline dumbbell press. These exercises will primarily train the chest, front delts, and triceps, with different movements emphasizing different muscles. The more vertical our press becomes, the more shoulders and upper chest that will be involved, and the more horizontal the press, the more middle and lower chest that will be involved. Next, we have an upper body pull. This is basically the opposite movement to the upper body push, which includes any movements where we pull towards our body from an overhead or a horizontal position. Some examples include pull-ups, pull-downs, and rows. These exercises will train the back muscles, rear delts, and biceps. Once again, different variations of pulls will emphasize different muscles. More vertical pulls will usually emphasize the lats, while more horizontal rows will train the upper back muscles like the traps and rear delts to a greater extent. Third, we have a lower body squat type movement. This is when we have simultaneous knee and hip extension, as we see during movements like squats and lunges. These exercises will primarily train the quads and glutes, with most variations preferencing the quads. And lastly, we have a lower body hinge. This refers to hip extension movements like deadlift and back extension variations. These exercises will primarily train the glutes and hamstrings, with different variations preferencing each muscle over the other. These 4 primary movements basically train all muscles in the body, and most full body hypertrophy training routines should probably be based on the primary movement categories. However, although all muscles will be somewhat involved with these 4 key movements, they may not necessarily maximize muscle growth of all muscles involved. There are multiple muscles which aren't heavily stressed with any of these lifts. Namely, here is a list of the smaller muscles which probably aren't directly targeted with these core movements. We have the biceps, triceps, forearms, calves, delts, upper traps, and abs. So the question is, should we be training these muscles directly, or will they receive enough of a stimulus from the primary compound lifts we are already performing? Before we answer this question, let's first briefly touch on why we should even be asking this question. Can't we just perform extra isolation lifts to train these muscles, just to be safe, so we don't have to worry about whether or not they are receiving enough of a stimulus? Well, you could do this, but this will probably make your training less time efficient. We only have a limited amount of time and effort we can train in the gym each week. So we basically want to get the most effective training stimulus within this time frame. So if we are performing extra exercises without it being necessary, then we are just making less efficient use of our time. This means instead of performing more exercises for a muscle group, we could have spent that time performing more volume for other muscles which require more direct training. So with this out of the way, let's now cover whether or not we should train these smaller muscles directly. The answer to this question is dependent on a few different variables and may differ for each individual muscle group. There are 3 primary factors which will help us answer this question, which we will now cover. First is the anatomy of the muscle we are talking about. Each muscle has a unique anatomical structure and contributes to different movements. In some cases, the muscle may receive a solid stimulus through compound lifts alone, and in other cases, the muscle may require isolation exercises to be maximally stressed. Without going into detail about each individual muscle, let's cover one example to explore what this means. For example, let's take the triceps. The triceps has 3 heads, 2 short heads and 1 long head. All 3 heads insert onto the ulna, which is one of the forearm bones. However, the 2 short heads originate on the humerus, which is the bone of the upper arm, while the long head originates on the scapula, which is the name of the shoulder blade bone. So all tricep heads act on the elbow joint, but the long head also acts on the shoulder joint too. What this means is that if we only perform pressing movements, the short head will be able to contribute maximally, although the long head won't, since it will be shortening at the elbow but lengthening at the shoulder, meaning that it doesn't really change length throughout the movement. This means that while the 2 heads will probably receive enough of a stimulus through pressing movements alone, the long head probably requires some isolation movements to be maximally stressed. This can be seen in this study, which compared chest and triceps hypertrophy from performing bench press and skull crushers in combination versus in isolation. As we can see, the 2 short heads saw decent growth with bench press training alone, although the long head didn't. But skull crushers, either in isolation or in combination with the bench press, resulted in far superior growth of the long head. So based on muscle anatomy, let's provide a quick summary about which muscles can fully contribute to the 4 primary compound movements we described at the beginning of the video, and which muscles won't. This is just a general guide based on muscle anatomy, but may not fully determine actual muscle growth outcomes. The triceps will partially be stimulated through pressing movements, while the biceps and calves won't be maximally recruited. The forearms, abs, delts, and traps will all likely be trained quite well through compound lifts, but may still require direct training due to one of the following factors we will now discuss. The second consideration is how the smaller muscle is responding to your current training routine. Naturally, some muscles will respond better to an exercise, while others won't. This may be due to lifting technique, but our genetic response to training will also play a major role. Each person has certain muscles which simply respond better than other muscles, even with the same amount of training. So if a smaller muscle is seeing good muscle growth from indirect training alone, then it may not be necessary to perform additional exercises for that muscle. On the other hand, if a muscle is lagging behind from only performing indirect training, then there is more reason to perform additional training for that muscle. This will be highly individual for each person and for different muscles on the same person. And the last dependent variable is our overall physique goals. Many people want to achieve a well-balanced physique where all muscles are developed relatively evenly across the entire body. Naturally, we all have certain muscles which are more or less developed relative to the rest of our physique. So if we want to achieve a well-balanced physique, we should devote more volume and effort to our lagging muscles, and less to our most developed muscles. This means that if a muscle is already one of our stronger areas, then we probably don't need to do more additional training for that muscle, even if it theoretically doesn't get maximally stimulated from compound lifts. On the other hand, we probably need to perform additional training for the muscles which are somewhat lagging behind, even if we are already getting a good stimulus from indirect training. Furthermore, some people may want to really emphasize certain muscle groups for their own personal reasons. In this case, trainees may want to perform more direct training to really emphasize these muscles. For example, a trainee may want to particularly emphasize the biceps, even if they are relatively well developed already. So even if they are getting a good stimulus from indirect training alone, they may want to perform more direct training to take them to the next level. So to summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. Essentially, the fundamental compound lifts will train basically all muscles in the body to some extent. However, these lifts may not provide enough stress for some smaller muscles, potentially resulting in suboptimal muscle growth. So whether we train these muscles directly with other exercises will be dependent on a few different variables. These are the anatomical structure of the muscle, the responsiveness of the muscle to the current training routine, and the overall physique goals of the trainee. In general, the biceps, triceps, and calves will usually require direct training for a well-balanced physique for most people. while the abs, forearms, upper traps, and delts will usually grow quite well from traditional compound lifts alone. However, this is very general advice, and everyone will have individual differences which may go against these general guidelines. Therefore, you should use the factors we discussed to make an individual decision of whether it is necessary to train each minor muscle group directly or not. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.